We have Dan here today with us, Senior Director of Product at Engaging Networks, and he is going to review the updates that we have made recently to our Engaging Networks Lightning Connector for Salesforce. It's our newest release that includes some pretty good updates that we really just wanted to share with you, make sure you're aware of so that you can take full advantage. So I'm going to hand it over to Dan, and he's going to walk us through the updates and the roadmap, and we'll be available to answer your questions. So please feel free to stick them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will pause for questions maybe halfway through, and then of course we'll have time at the end as well. So Dan, over to you.
Great. I wouldn't mind if in the chat anyone can say if they're current users or if they're new clients, etc., just so I can sort of sculpt where we want to focus on. The intent of today was to specifically focus on the new package features that we have, as well as the roadmap items for the connector. So it's good to see that everyone is sort of a current user. So if that's so, then kind of the expectation is that I'll spend more time going deeper than I will at the top level. And I think that's kind of a good cadence to where we are.
Looks like mostly current or existing users. We do have at least one new client joining us today. Welcome. And
Okay.
then a couple of Salesforce partners as well.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you very much for everyone for taking time to join us today. So why are we essentially having this webinar today is we wanted to give you information on two particular areas that we've been focusing on. You may have noticed that we now have gone onto the App Exchange. So there was a period of work where we upgraded our package. I went through the security reviews. And then whilst we were doing that, we made some big changes to the latest package, which is now the 1.32 for adding in improvements, but then also to put us in a perspective of being able to make new additions to the Engaging Networks connection, which I'll go through in a little bit. So just to iterate that the latest package now available is 1.32. And the key things that we did work on that package is adding a new group by function on transactional information, which I'll do a demo on. And then behind the scenes, we've added like a merge audit trail log, and then we've added a duplicate endpoint, and then also included some improvements to be able to position ourselves for the work that Engaging Networks is going to be doing. And then some key highlights that we've noted is that we're doing the App Exchange. We've been doing quite a lot of discovery, and now we're aligning work for this new package. And then as of currently, we're also working on new mappings for our new peer-to-peer tool that is coming out next year as well. So during discovery and aligning with feedback and hearing what people have been saying about the tool, is overall it's working, things are flowing, but there was a need for more flexibility in the deduplication handling. So right now on the contact side, we have a fuzzy last name, fuzzy first name, and a strict email address rule that an Engaging Networks employs on ourselves to then look up any duplicates that we hear, duplicate matches that we hear on the upserts that are going into Salesforce. The process of manually merging records is a manual one. So if you're in Salesforce and you manually merge two records, then you'd have to go to Engaging Networks and manually merge, and vice versa. We're seeing clients saying that they wanted to represent multiple email addresses in one contact. And this model can create multiples, duplicates, and things like that. When you merge contacts together, then the user comes to Engaging Networks, fills in the contact again, and then that new contact is created. And what we've kind of essentially heard back is that high donors would use one email address and then a multiple one from another donation form. But then in terms of representing that, you want that to be as one contact with multiple email addresses. So we've looked towards how a solution can be framed around that. then representing one campaign member against multiple transaction rows. So sometimes you would have multiple transactions pertaining to one thing being generated. This might be an email to target form. So I fill in a form, and then we write 4 transactions, and that are essentially the same page, but there are 4 transactions denoting that it might be that the different contacts that email to target form is rendering. So it caused an issue with being able to represent that in campaign members or objects that only wanted one representation. And then also that workflows was replaced by flows. So in the package 1.32, the notables that have been put into place is this group by staging records, which is a feature that essentially allows you to group multiple transactions together, but process them in one. We've added a new trigger on the contact called a merged contact audit trail. So when a contact is merged in Salesforce and the contact has a value present in the Ian supporter ID field, we generate another object, which is the merge audit, and essentially it tracks the losing Ian ID and then the winning ID. And then that means that we can now have a job that runs and sees, okay, what mergers have happened that are related to the Engaging Networks account, and then automatically merge them in Engaging Networks. So the merging would take place in Salesforce, and the mirroring would then happen in Engaging Networks. So transactions would then apply to the winning supporter, and the contact details would apply to that winning supporter. And then we've added a REST endpoint for duplicate matching, which I'll cover a little bit in a bit of a demo. But essentially what we've done is currently in Engaging Networks, if a deduplication rule is triggered and it comes through in the contact push, we then try ourselves using a fuzzy first name, fuzzy last name, and a strict email address to try find a representative in Salesforce. What we've done is we've added a REST endpoint that where they're going to be able, you can then potentially leverage, and that would then use Salesforce native duplication and matching rules. So we would just pass what we know of the supporter to Salesforce, and then Salesforce would give us back options given on using the duplicate and matching rules. And then additional improvements in the package that we've added a transaction timestamp. So this is a formula field that just that where it takes the transaction date and transaction time and then puts it together. So this is kind of handy in this group matching rule that I'll demo in a little bit. And then we've just done some housekeeping. We're updating the decard values screen for better readability. The Ian and transaction ID on the opportunity is now unique in an external ID. We've added the mapping name to the delete modal, so you know exactly which mapping you're deleting to be sure. And then there's a save and close button that has been added to the mapping rule. So what I will do is let me first go specifically into the package updates that we have in 1.34, and then I can speak to what Engaging Networks development team is doing to then leverage what we've pushed out in that package. So if I hop into Salesforce, you'll see that we are on the Engaging Networks panel. And I'll just go back to some staging records. So I've imported some test staging records into the account. And it's sort of a test file of all different types of transactions. If I head over to mapping rules and have a look at a common issue where this takes place is under the advocacy update existing campaign member mapping rule. If I open this up, essentially what this mapping rule is saying is that I'm going to find advocacy-based transactions like petitions, email to targets, click to calls, and tweet to targets. and then I want to write them as a campaign member. If I have a look here at the staging records, and I'll just open up the advocacy transactions unprocessed, you'll see this is an example of what I was mentioning, is that Zanzibar.Grim's Tell Amazing Stories took part in the Ian campaign called Test for Custom Target Envelope. But we generated multiple transactions because they're targeting different people. So this, in one submission, they're going to send an email to Dan at AOL, Dan at Engaging, Dan at Yahoo Test, Hotmail Test, etc. So there's one submission, but multiple transactions have taken place. If I head over to this mapping rule, and if I'll just run it, manually process, let's wait a couple of seconds. Let's see what happens. So behind the scene, what's happening is that I'm running this mapping rule. A batch is being created, and then it's trying to take these transactions and then write them out. But it's never going to work because campaign ID and Salesforce contact ID is blank. So what I'll do is I'll head over to contact top-up. And this is another indication of why this group staging records by is actually quite powerful. So here you'll see that, sorry, pardon me, went to the wrong one. Top up, edit. So the group staging records by is now saying for this contact top up rule, I'm going to find where contact IDs are blank, but I can now group them by something. So in this queue of staging records, I have like 300 unique transactions. But what I've done is I've said, let me group them by supporter ID. So then that means that each row is a unique ID. And then if I go and run this, manually process, this feature is actually really useful in testing because it means that I can just upload a blank set of transactions, and then I can run two rules, which is contact top up and campaign create, and then it will automatically create the contacts and then create the unique campaigns, which will allow me to do testing on. So you see here, the SFTC contact is now being created, and now it's unique. There's only one contact for each of for these groupings together, which is really useful. I'll do the same for campaign create. I'll click on manually process. And what that will do is it will create unique campaigns for all the transactions. So you see here, you've got multiple campaigns. It'll only create one for each of these. So it provides quite a useful level of flexibility in your transactional processing. If you have any custom rules you wanted to say, like create campaigns or create things based on groups of things. So just to echo what I was saying here is if I run this template and manually process, what I would receive and the expectation that I'll receive is that I'll receive an error saying that one of the campaign members has already been added, and then these transactions can't be dealt with anymore. But what happens in the group example, if I edit that up, you're now able to go, okay, well, we know that some of these might be multiples, so let me group them by campaign name, support email, email and address and transaction type, which that means that an order by transaction date time. So only one of those transactions would be used to write the campaign member, and then the other transactions will have a note saying these aren't going to be used the previous because there's already been a transaction that's been processed from it. I might just have a look here. Yeah. So this is just a quick demo of how this functionality would work, and then without having to clear everything out. So I believe this is a very useful feature in the package because it gives a lot of flexibility of being able to do these rules that will group by transactions. And then coupled with rule completion steps, matching rules, the querying, and the mapping, you have a very kind of powerful tool to be able to represent any object on the staging queue to the business rules that you need within your Salesforce platform. I just take a quick look, you can see those contacts are being created and all those active campaigns are being created. If I look at Zanzibar Grins, we should be able to see the campaign history. Campaign name has been responded and taken part. So just to sort of echo what this means and what this means. So in September, so tomorrow, we're going to be pushing off one update that specifically is going to be using the 1.32 package. You'll see when you log into your account, and if I head over to data and reports in Salesforce, so nothing will change tomorrow when everything gets pushed. The Salesforce sync will operate as usual, unless you came to the settings, and you'll see that you will have matching rules and fuzzy matching if you've chosen to do that, but likelihood you would if you're pushing contact data to Salesforce, and you're leveraging this. You'll see that there's an option of then selecting leverage Salesforce, and it's currently in beta. And I'm very interested to hear who would like to sort of test this out and in a sandbox environment. And you can probably just either ping and chat, or after there's going to be a survey, if you could just note whether or not you'd be interested in help in sort of testing this in a sort of sandbox environment and see how it uses. That would be really helpful. Essentially, what this does is engaging networks will push contacts to Salesforce. If they receive any duplicate errors, we would then go into, I'm going to try find the appropriate contact ID for Minnie Hayward, and these are all fake addresses. So instead of trying to find Minnie Hayward using a fuzzy and a strict match, we would then pass these details that we have on the contact mapping to Salesforce, and then they would return back the appropriate like priority ruling or percentage of what match that would be. And then we would match that to an email address, and then being able to write the contact ID and push that forward. Yeah. So to note, though, that email address is still the unique identifier in engaging networks. So there is still logic and that needs to be put into place in thinking that you can't use the Salesforce deduplication tools to do nothing on the email address and try mimic a complete householding requirement. Unfortunately, so email address is still the unique identifier in engaging networks. Speaking with a partner, Jake, from Purple Otter, he recommended that you use an actual particular user that is only being used in the Salesforce to engaging networks connection, and that would use the deduplication and matching rules. Only in that he's seen, for example, Zapier. If you have a Zapier connection, that might conflict with the rules in Salesforce, because engaging networks on the matching rule, we need the alert checkbox enabled in order for us to be able to see and receive the duplicate matching rule on the upsert of the CSV file. So that's something to consider, is that on the deduplication and matching rules, they need to have that checkbox alert enabled, and you can read that on the help supportal. And then potentially, if you are using a different integrations, maybe Zapier or another tool that's pushing contact data in from a different system, potentially having engaging networks have its own user to and deduplication rules to be able to make them both work at the same time together.
Dan, is this a good time to pause for questions?
Yeah, I think so. There's we covered a lot in the package, so I just
Yeah.
wanted to check if anyone makes the sense of where we
So
are.
Jared was asking, the new endpoint is publicly accessible. You must have mentioned something about the API endpoints.
It would be accessible, but you still need the bearer token. So obviously engaging networks through the authentication would then connect, and then you'd only be able to use that endpoint based on the bearer. So in theory, if you did your own authentication, you could leverage it as well.
Great. Hopefully that answers your question. If not, let us know. Liam asks or wanted to mention that the connector creates a lot of duplicate contacts and they cannot figure out why. I don't know if you have any suggestions there.
Um, I would double check. So I was on a call last month, and one of the reasons why one of the organizations duplicate matching wasn't throwing back was that under the matching rules, let me just have a look. Fuzzy match. Action on edit is we need to report it. And then that was one thing that was preventing like us knowing that a duplicate was being hit. And there's documentation on the support on that. So I would double check that as a first place to start, because you should be, if that's enabled in the logs, you should be able to see that the failed count. And then in looking at the failures, you should be able to see that duplicates are being returned, and then engaging networks can then take action on trying to match those duplicates together. So Liam, that would be my first port of call. And then you can kind of let us know what you see, and then we can kind of have maybe help figure out a solution if that's the case.
Would the leveraging tool help, the leverage Salesforce matching help with this, do you think?
You'd still need the appropriate duplicate matching rules to be in place. So inside Salesforce, the duplicate and matching rules tell anything in Salesforce that if you try to create a contact, if there's another one that looks similar, then alert to it. And that's how Engaging Networks does the same, is that we try push a CSV file every 20 minutes. And then if that CSV file fails due to duplicates seen, we receive a log back, and that's what the CSV file. So these are the errors that have been returned. And then the duplicate, we then look at this file and say, there's a duplicate found. We're going to then now go into the fuzzy matching job, which then tries to align the contact IDs. And if it's a contact ID that's been found, it will populate it and then re-push the batch because it's found the appropriate contact ID. Are you representing multiple email addresses in one contact, Liam? Not always, but sometimes. And this is also another area where multiple contacts would be created after the merging has taken place, because if that email address comes in, you'd get another contact, and there might be some just variations going on in there. Yeah, to just want all people with. So I would double check the first port of call is double check the deduplication rules, make sure that the alert is present, and then check that in the error logs you actually are receiving duplicate error messages coming back. And then let us know on that.
We have another question around duplicates. So when grouping staging records, the previous connector used to merge up to batches of 200 records. leaving some duplicates across batches. Is this fixed in the new connector?
Yeah, so that's where also the matching um, grouping rules will really help solve for that. Um, but ultimately, there's Salesforce does things in batches. Um, so in terms of the batching side, I know this is also like a little bit of a quick tip. Um, in the say, for example, on contact top up, and by default, when you create a new mapping rule, there's we defaulted to 200, I believe. If you use the export tool, and I'll just select the contact top up, you'll see that there's an actual this is the JSON representation of that rule. If you ever needed to increase or decrease it, for example, you could set it to 50. You could download it, for example, tweak the JSON, make it 50, and then if you import that, you'd be able to then tweak the batch size on that mapping rule. Or you could kind of go via the like sort of object inspector and then manipulate it. But that's a workaround currently to be able to increase or decrease individual mapping rules batch sizes.
I think that's all the questions we have for now. So
If we head back to the Salesforce webinar and Salesforce slides, so in September, this will be going out. And again, I'd be very interested to see if anyone would like to trial test this in their sandbox environment and see how this works. That'd be great. And then in November, we have 2 more improvements to try improve just the general admin of Salesforce to be able to reduce the sort of the duplicates that you're seeing. And I believe that 2 things will help with this. One is the ability to allow for mergers in Salesforce to then occur in engaging networks. And in the new package, there's a trigger that exists that if I merge contact B into contact A, and B has a supporter ID, meaning engaging networks is likely push this contact to Salesforce, then another audit record will be written, and it's called engaging networks merge audit. And on that object is like a timestamp. It has like some details of the winning and the losing. And then that means that engaging networks can then run a job every 20 minutes or an hour. So in the logic that we have and go like, okay, who was merges happened? I'm going to use this merge audit log, and then I'm going to represent those in engaging networks. And these will be settings that you have to enable in order to do that. We wouldn't just push this and then automatically happen. So what you can expect is that there'd be settings on this page that would allow you to enable the leverage of the API or enable the mirroring of the merges in Salesforce. And then as well as the final piece of the kind of the puzzle to this is on page processing. So in viewing a contact that's got multiple email addresses as one contact, part of the problem is that I'm a contact, I get merged, and then I go and then use another email address. Another contact would be created. So how to prevent that loop? So what the plan is currently is to then implement a page processing check that if multiple email addresses are enabled, we then check that on processing. And what I mean by that is I'm a supporter. In engaging networks, you have the email address, the secondary email address. You'd be able to map the primary email address to an email address field in Salesforce. And then you'd be able to map the secondary email address to a secondary email address field in Salesforce. So this is kind of representation of the MPSP model that is currently set. A supporter comes to engaging networks, they fill in a page. What we do is, does the email address match on primary or secondary? If it does match on email primary, we would then just do what you do now. If it doesn't match at all, we would then create a new supporter. The new logic, though, is that if that submission, if the email matches on the secondary email address, we'll update the supporter record in terms of like the field values, but we would keep intact the email address and secondary email address. We would write the transaction, which would link directly back to that supporter, but the thank you email would be sent to the supporter's email address that they use on page submission. So on the front of it, the supporter's filling in the details, but behind the scenes, we're acknowledging that this supporter is represented in one supporter record. And then we would preserve the supporter record. We wouldn't create a new supporter. The email and the secondary email would stay the same, but then the transaction would get written. So then in Salesforce, it would then go to the contact and written to the contact. So the pro of that is that it then represents and it keeps intact the single contact object model. The caveat that is that in engaging networks, we email out on the primary email field. So it'll be a choice at the org level whether you utilize this, because if you do want to email people on multiple contacts and email addresses, then having contacts as their own unique contacts would allow you to do that, because there'd be a one-to-one representation in Salesforce to engaging networks. And then things like opt-in questions and their preferences would all remain intact. Because part of the headbender was of how would you represent with multiple email addresses on one contact when that one contact could have multiple opt-in and preferences. Gets pretty complicated. So this is a way of being able to sort of represent that, with the caveat that then the email address would be the one that would be emailed out on. So how that would be represented is in the contact mapping. Email address here would be the primary. And then when you click on manage fields, there'd be a secondary email address. And then you'd add that, and then you'd be able to select the additional email address for that. So the logic here would be this would be the primary email address, and then the secondary email address would be set on the contact mapping. And then we'll have an additional setting that says, yes, I want to use this logic to look up the secondary contact field. I do want to flag that our first initial phase of this work will only support two. So email address and secondary email address. Adding a support for a third tertiary email address is potentially a Q1 item for next year. We're interested in hearing how many organizations are using the third email address and how much use cases that they're seeing. In chatting to a few clients, the two email addresses is where the sort of the median range is. Obviously, there's edge cases, but we'd really like to hear like what the tertiary side of it for an extra email address would be needed.
Dan,
yes,
we have a couple questions. So I just wanted to pause for a second, if that's okay.
Sure.
Jose was wondering, and you may have said this, maybe I missed it, I'm sorry, but the primary email, how is that identified? Is it the first email that comes in?
Well, we would check on both. So at the supporter level, a supporter would have like their email address as bobjones@hotmail.com, And then their secondary email address has been set at bb_fam@hotmail. So on page submission, we would say, does this email address match on both fields? But the primary email address has been specified because there's an actual value in a field placing in Engaging Networks for that. So it would have to hold the value of the primary, and that would hold the value of the secondary email address. So then on the contact mapping, this is the primary. So whatever's in this field would be considered the primary. And then you'd add the secondary email address, which is the Engaging Networks field, and then link that to whatever in Salesforce. And then that would be what the secondary would be perceived as.
Okay, so it sounds like if you have a new supporter that's not in your system, the primary email address is going to be whatever email
Correct.
they use first. And then if they came in and used a secondary one, that would then
Yeah.
be okay.
So the secondary email would only ever really be populated by an admin or a choice of making that
Got it.
secondary email present.
Okay.
So if an ordinarily day-to-day people filling in email addresses, they would all be these primary email addresses. It'd be the case of in Salesforce, you wanting to actually represent that one contact with multiple email addresses, and then Engaging Networks mirrors that. And then there's logic to keep that connection stable and same without automatically always creating the new contacts.
Okay. Sort of a not similar question, but in this same sort of topic, for the merge that starts in Salesforce and is mirrored in Engaging Networks, what happens if both of them have an Engaging Networks ID and different email addresses? Will the winning record in Salesforce become the winning record in Engaging Networks?
That's all fun that we're going to be ironing out in November. Yeah, that's a good point. There's a lot of like use cases and edge cases that we're going to iron out. But in its simplistic view, is that in Engaging Networks, there's a primary ID and there's a supporter ID. And in Salesforce, you have a contact, and usually that supporter ID is carried over. So when you merge one contact to another, we then know that that's the supporter ID that would be the winner. And then we would then go, okay, what was the losing supporter ID? Let's take a look. And then we're going to merge it to the winning supporter ID in Engaging Networks. And then that would mean that we would probably have to throw out some error in if you had like some of these primary IDs or emails in different places. There'd probably be some edge cases around that. But in theory, if the databases are both in sync, then the merging of it would then you be able to mirror that in Engaging Networks. It's like the dirty data. That's the hard side of it. Is like how do you catch the dirty data side of it to then be able to alert that this is not possible. This kind of needs a manual intervention.
Another question in the chat. When the contact information is pulled from Salesforce and the SFDC contact ID is not in Engaging Networks, I understand the connector will use the SFDC contact's email to find the supporter, but what email field is used for this? Is it the standard email or the email field I choose in the EM contact mapping for email address?
So email address is the unique identifier in Engaging Networks. So that's kind of the law of the land when it comes to the Engaging Networks world. So if a file comes in, import from Engaging Networks, in the Salesforce world, we use the contact ID as the first rule to try link them up and to update. Without that being present, the next thing is to use the primary email address to then try and find or match that record to a supporter Engaging Networks. And it's the primary email address field.
Will that be the SFDC standard email address?
You have to declare that in the contact mapping. So we don't really get involved in that. What you have to set what that would be in Salesforce in the contact rule here. So I guess, for example, like if you used alternate email address, but then that I imagine from business rules in the contact side, you'd have to make sure that then that would, as an org, that's seen as the email address that people use and enter and things like that.
Follow-up question from Jose here. We've got processes that change the standard email in Salesforce when an incoming transaction comes in. What happens when the standard email is changed in Salesforce? This email will travel to engaging networks and take all attributes from the previous email. That means it can become subscribed to certain lists that the email hasn't given consent. Not sure
Yes.
if it makes sense, but let me know.
So what I'm understanding here is that there's a contact in Salesforce and you're tweaking the email address. What happens? So if the contact ID is present in engaging networks, then we would update the email address in engaging networks because contact ID is present in engaging networks. We can then match the pushback, and that would update the email address. If there was a contact in Salesforce that you tweaked the email address for, and it came over to engaging networks, if there was no supporter that matched the contact ID, we would try, okay, well, let's try create a new supporter using the email address and file. If it then found that email address, it would use that one, and then that would be the new contact ID. That's put into place.
Okay. And say hopefully that answered your question. If not, let us know. One more question. When the losing ENID is identified in the merge audit trail after records have been merged in Salesforce, what is the action we need to take? Would we lose data or opt-in preferences if no action is taken?
So there'll be a setting that you'll have to check, which is like, I want to use the automatic merge functionality. So the way that Salesforce, and we kind of went on this like kind of how are we going to solve for this? Because actually Salesforce itself intrinsically doesn't keep track of merges. So there's actually not an easy API for you to go, hey, Salesforce in the last hour, what has gotten merged? So we actually found online this like workaround that people have been using and representing, and that actually the trigger creates this audit log by using this method. So we are only writing the audit log that a merge has occurred. The fact that one of the losing has gone, that's just the Salesforce thing. Like that contact's been merged now. So the only reference is that we know that in engaging networks, that was the losing ID, and we're going to merge that with the winning ID. So in theory, that should just automatically occur because those are using the audit log. We then know to then merge the loser with the winner in engaging networks.
All right, that's all the questions for right now. Move on. We only have about 15 more minutes. And I think we're going to move on.
All right. So I think that covers everything. Like that's pretty much in a nutshell what the new updates coming in. There's a lot. I know there's a lot to digest. So we're going to be updating the academy and updating support materials to be able to sort of represent all that's going on in this world. But hopefully these updates will prove fruitful. At the end of this webinar, there is a survey, and I'd really appreciate it if you took the time to just do the survey, because then it'll give us a better understanding of where people are, who's using the tool, and then kind of satisfaction levels and things like that. And if whether or not you'd be interested in helping with the seeing how the deduplication check works using Salesforce as well. Be helpful to have a contact there if anyone's up for it.
Right. Any more questions for Dan? That's
Yeah, Jose, it seems like it's a bit of an interesting workaround what you're dealing with. Like in theory, the opt-in question, if it's tied to the contact, there's always, I mean, that's what it's kind of interesting to know how the flow would happen on that. But even in engaging networks, if I merge two supporters together, the transactional information has to be tied to a supporter. It has to go somewhere. And if the other supporter had opted out or opted in, they would still be representative in their flow. However, their top line opt-in question I would presume, would remain, because was their preference. Unless there's some like real nuance where we also check on timestamp on the last opt-in question, and then one might have just recently unsubscribed and one has opted in, and then when those merge happens, we're taking the most recent, and you could argue that's proper logic because then that is the most recent occurrence of that merge. But I think that's what's going on to describe what you're describing. I'm not sure.
All right, we have another question. Do you have any help documentation on how to get the previous version of the Engaging Networks connector and associated transaction records out of our organization?
So version 1, the connector.
So let's see what. Please feel free to just chime in the chat.
Yeah, if you're representing the one contact in the one email address in was a one contact, the multiple email just one contact. If BFAM subscribed and then opted in, then that essentially that one contact is getting the opt-in. Yeah.
Are you answering Jose's question from the chat?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so Felice says yes, if we're on V2 now. Okay, so just to repeat the question, do you have any help documentation on how to get the previous version of the Engaging Networks connector and associated transaction records out of our board? Sounds like they're on V2 now.
So you were on V1, but now you're on you're in V2.
That's what it sounds like.
Are you just wanting to export the import record staging queue?
One app is called Engaging Networks V1, the other is called Engaging Networks Connector V2.
Yeah. This might be an email. If you email support, we could maybe get bubbled up and we can kind of figure out what that would look like.
Yeah. Yep. Good plan. All right. Jose says follow up. So mass emails will go to the primary email then.
Yeah. I mean, this is the choice that org needs to make. Like ultimately the design of it is, if you want to use this in this flow, then this is how that would represent it. But if you wanted to email those people, then having them as one contact would solve for that.